Well, Moses had grown up in Pharaoh's palace, a Hebrew child raised among Egyptian royalty, and you may remember that didn't end well. He'd once tried to make a difference by standing up for one of his enslaved Hebrew brothers, and he ended up killing an Egyptian, and that's when he ended up fleeing Egypt and living in the desert. He started over. He married, he settled into a quiet rhythm of keeping sheep in a dry land, and this is where we find him in Exodus chapter 3. 80 years behind him, and probably, so he thinks, not many surprises ahead, except there's God. Now, I love to tell this story because it invites us to always keep our eyes peeled for what God is doing now and what God might do next. A bush caught flame on the slope of Horeb, not usually unusual in this dry desert climate. In that kind of a climate, bushes could spontaneously combust at any time. This would not have been something that Moses hadn't seen before. What was unusual was that after the bush stopped burning, it didn't burn up. Its branches stayed upright. Its leaves didn't curl up into ash. The fire had all the heat and the shimmer of flame, but none of the consumption, none of the destruction. The bush was burning, but it wasn't burning up. And Moses, 80-year-old Moses, worn out, tending to his sheep in the desert, well, he stopped and he noticed. He was curious, and so he paid attention, and that is the hinge of this story. The miracle is not only that the bush burned and did not burn up, but that Moses stopped long enough to notice. There's an imaginative telling of this scene that you may remember where there are other shepherds in the desert who pass by this bush too, never stopping to notice the miracle. They glanced, they shrugged, they kept on walking. It was only Moses who stayed long enough to realize this wasn't a mirage. This wasn't a figment of his imagination. This was something unusual happening, which is something we ought to sit with for at least a second this morning. Because it takes a certain kind of patience to see the difference between an ordinary flame and the fire of God. Patience is not popular in our culture. It's easier for us to keep on moving, to assume we know what we're seeing in every instance, to simply keep looking as Moses might have done for the next patch of grass. But Moses paused. Moses lingered. Moses took time to see. Elizabeth Barrett Browning once put it like this: "Earth's crammed with heaven, and every common bush afire with God. But only he who sees takes off his shoes. The rest sit around it and pluck blackberries." And Elizabeth could have been writing that for us too. Most of the time, most of us are in a hurry. We scroll on our phones while the sun sets. We pluck our berries without even noticing the bush we're plucking them from is glowing. We walk through ordinary days completely unaware that the ground under our feet, as we sang earlier in this service, is holy. But every now and then, there's a flicker at the edge of our vision that catches our attention. Light filters through the stained glass window in a way that stops our breath. A child's laughter interrupts the heaviness of the day. Silence settles into a hospital room and it almost feels alive. Or maybe we hear the cry of suffering. We hear the voice of a stranger. We notice the beauty of a night sky that is too wide and too vast to explain. The fire dances. The question then is whether or not you and I will stop long enough to notice. Will we pause? Will we turn aside? Will we linger long enough to see what's actually going on? I remember a moment like this happening, and you may remember me telling this story several years ago when Christy and I lived in Paris, and my mom came to visit us, and we were walking around the Notre Dame Cathedral. My mother stopped in front of a small stained glass window that was actually a large stained glass window, one of the most famous stained glass windows in the world, and as we were standing there in silence, she leaned over to me and she whispered gently, "You know, Jason, you know what this reminds me of? This reminds me of the stained glass window in the sanctuary at First Baptist Atlanta, Texas." And I still make fun of her for that today. Because here we were in the most famous cathedral in France, and what she saw in that moment was our little church in East Texas. But the more I've thought about that over the years, the more I've realized actually she was right. Because the same light shines through both places. Holiness, no matter where we are, is often hidden in plain sight. You just have to be willing to pause long enough to see it. And that's what Moses did here. He stopped. He lingered. And then in the lingering, he heard his name. "Moses, Moses, here I am." And that small word, and it's just one word in the Hebrew, that's when the moment turned. The word means readiness or presence. It means I'm here with all that I am. I'm here ready to listen. I'm here ready to respond. And this is the moment in that response when liberation in Exodus begins, which is a good reminder for all of us. Moses was 80 years old in this moment. Moses was 80 years old when his story finally really began to open up. His best days, he might have thought, were behind him, but they weren't. The bush then says to every single one of us, no matter how young we are or how old we are, no matter what we've been through or haven't been through yet, keep your eyes open. Never stop looking. Never stop paying attention, because holiness can surprise you at 6 or 20 or 80 at any age, in any palace or any pasture, when we're sure of our purpose, when we're sure it's finished, or when we think we know exactly where life is going to lead next. God can break in at any time. "Take off your sandals," the voice said, "for where you are standing is holy ground." Was it? I mean, maybe he'd been here, but was it holy ground? What was different about this patch of ground than any other patch of ground? It was still dirt. It was still desert and stone and sand. The sheep were still milling around, probably wondering why their shepherd was talking to a shrub. Perhaps there was something particularly holy about this ground, or perhaps the holiness of a space is simply about how we're fully present in it. Here, for whatever reason, a patch of wilderness becomes a sanctuary. It seems not only because God was there, but because Moses stopped long enough to notice. I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, the voice said, and Moses hid his face. His sandals were off, his heart was pounding, and he continued to linger there in the midst of the mystery. And then came the hook. Then came the calling. God had seen the misery of God's people in Egypt. God had heard their cry, and now God was sending Moses back to bring them out. And if you listen closely enough, you can almost hear Moses swallow hard. This was not a call to spend more time worshiping here at the burning bush. This was a call to go back to Egypt, back to the land that he had fled, back to the cries of his enslaved people. That might have stopped someone else in their tracks. But Moses responded, and he kept going. He kept going and asked, when I go to them, who should I tell them is sending me? And then in that moment, it was God who spoke the words that scholars are still wrestling with today. I am who I am. Say to the Israelites that I am has sent you. Others have translated it, I will be what I will be. But either way, the Hebrew here resists being pinned down. God offers something in a name here that's more alive than most names. It's like a verb or a breath or existence itself. In the Jewish tradition, you know, this name is treated with such reverence that it is rarely spoken. Instead of saying Yahweh, readers usually say something like Adonai, the Lord, or Hashem, the name. Because God, they know, is more than a word on our lips. God is the presence we cannot capture or control. And this is where the focus of our series begins to sharpen a bit too. Because Jesus, generations later, in the middle of an argument with some of the religious leaders of his day, said the line, before Abraham was, I am. We said that earlier too. Before Abraham was, I am. And everyone who was listening knew what that meant. Everyone who was listening knew that he was echoing the voice that spoke to Moses, that he was naming himself with the name that came from the bush. A claim that was staggering for the people, so much so that they picked up their stones and prepared to kill him. To those who were listening, it was blasphemy. But to the church, it became gospel. Jesus was not only a prophet speaking for God, Jesus was the very presence of God, the eternal I am walking among us. The fire that blazed in the bush was now burning again, but this time in human form. The whisper at the bush becomes a shout in Christ, which once again invites us to never stop looking. Because the task that was Moses's then is the same for us in every age. To turn aside, to see, to be curious, to be ready, to notice God's presence is always present and God's voice is always ready to lead us just a little bit further. Now at this point, Moses probably had begun to wish that he hadn't noticed anything. Moses probably had begun to wish that the bush had only burned and never spoke. It's easier to explain a flaming shrub to your spouse than to explain that you're moving back to Egypt because a plant told you to do it. They'd grown comfortable in obscurity. It's one thing to take off your sandals before a flame in the desert. It's another thing to march back into Egypt and face Pharaoh. But this is the way holy encounters work. They're never just about what happens in the moment. They're almost always about what happens next. Which means to meet the living God is to be sent. To encounter God is not to stay, but to be sent. That was true for Moses, and it's true for us as well. The presence that fills us and comforts us is also the same presence that sends us. And here again in this story, we hear the whispers of Christ. The church fathers looked at the burning bush and they saw a glimpse of the incarnation. Divine fire dwelling in human flesh without destroying it. Augustine said the bush symbolized Israel aflame with God's presence, and Mary, who bore the Word made flesh and yet was not consumed by it. Origen and Gregory of Nyssa spoke of the infinite dwelling in the finite without undoing it. The miracle for them, in other words, was not just that the bush burned and wasn't burned up, but that it prepared us to recognize Christ, the Word who became flesh and dwelt among us. The eternal flame in mortal flesh, humanity glowing with divinity, not destroyed but transfigured. And the Bible tells us that same Spirit burns in us. Paul says that you and I are temples of the Holy Spirit. Paul says that Christ lives in us, that we are ordinary shrubs filled, aflamed with the presence of God. We are, in other words, God's burning bushes scattered throughout the earth, which may be both comforting and unsettling. Comforting because it means God's presence will not destroy us. Unsettling because it means people might see and should see God's fire in us. To live with Christ inside of us is to burn with a love that cannot be hidden, to shine with a mercy that makes the ground around us and others feel holy, to carry a holiness into the world that might stop someone else in their tracks. I mean, think of how Christ embodied it. He walked among the poor with compassion. He confronted the powerful with courage. He carried the cross with a love no cruelty could extinguish, and when he rose, the flame became unstoppable. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. This is the fire that we're all meant to carry. To notice it when it flickers at the edge of our vision, to turn aside and say, "Here I am," and then when it sends us to go into the cries of the suffering, into the struggles of our neighbors, and into the Pharaoh systems of every age. You may not see a bush blazing in the desert, but you may encounter a stranger who needs your welcome. You may see a neighbor who needs a meal. You may come upon a child who needs a special kind of encouragement that only you can give. You might just feel the Spirit tugging at you in prayer or nudging you toward a courage you did not know you had. Every single one of those moments has the potential to be holy ground. Everyone may carry the fire of God. You don't have to look far. Holy ground is closer than any of us thinks. Sometimes it's waiting in your inbox. Sometimes it's knocking at your front door. Sometimes it's sitting across your dinner table or beside you in these pews. The call of God still burns. The flame of God is still alive. The voice of God is still speaking. And when we answer, "Here I am," we find what Moses found out. That the great I Am is already here, already with us, already burning with a love that will never be consumed but will always transform. Already calling us to notice and to step into whatever God has for us next. What is it that you think God has for you next? What is it that God has been trying to get your attention for you to see? What is it that you think God is trying to draw you into and send you out toward next?